Hi, my name is Brent Sellers. I'm the Extension Wheat Specialist and Center Director at the UF-IFAS Range Cattle and Research and Education Center. I'll be joined today by Clay Cooper, who is the Livestock and Natural Resources Agent in Citrus County. And today, we're going to talk about plants, to eat or not to eat. Believe it or not, many of the plants we eat today have some toxic properties to them, but we learned from experience over time how to use those plants and how to make them non-toxic, or in some cases, they've actually bred the toxins out of these plants over time. So let's look at a few of the examples that are out there, but there are many more to consider. So one of the examples I like to talk about is tomato. A ripe tomato is non-toxic, but green tomatoes contain a product called tomatine. And generally, you have to eat a lot of this for it to really cause problems, but it could cause some digestive disturbances, just like the other relatives to the tomato, like tomatillo or potato. So potatoes, when they turn green, like this one's starting to, it produces a product called solanine, and it's only in that green area. So when we go to cook potatoes that have already turned green, a lot of times you just cut that green part off and cook them, and they will be fine to eat. But again, most of this just causes some digestive disturbances, upset stomach, and so on. The next one is apple. So the apple, we eat the outside flesh, but we don't eat the inside core. And the core, because the core is very fibrous for one, but it also contains seeds, and the seeds is actually what is toxic in the apple. We also have the cherry. So again, we eat the outside flesh, but it's the seed in the cherry that's toxic. Or in the case of wild cherries, if somebody cuts a wild cherry tree down, as those leaves start to wilt, they become more palatable to livestock. So then the livestock go and eat them, and that's one of the species that's acutely toxic to livestock. Another plant that we eat the flesh of is avocado. And we eat the flesh on the inside, it's non-toxic. The outside skin, as well as the seed and the remainder of the tree, is considered to be toxic. And kids, you hit a home run today. Broccoli is also considered toxic. But parents, it's okay. It takes a very large amount of broccoli for it to be toxic. So sorry kids, you still got to eat your broccoli. So I talked about domestic plants, but people also used to eat weeds, and still do in some cases. So one of the weeds that you read about people eating some time ago was called common pokeweed. This is actually considered a toxic plant as well. But what they would do is they would take off the young leaves off of young plants. And this plant is actually a little bit too old, but they take the young leaves, put them in a pot, and boil them, drain the water, put new water in, boil them again, and they may even do that a third time. They say it kind of tastes like spinach. I actually like spinach a little bit, so I'll just stick with the spinach. Why are plants toxic? What's the reasoning behind that? Well, let's think about a plant for a little bit. What can we do that plants can't? One of those is we can move around and we can defend ourselves. We can get out of danger. Plants can't do that. So how do they defend themselves? Well, one of the ways is on this thistle, it's wilted so it's not so spiny, has sharp spines on it. Another plant that a lot of us are very familiar with is tropical soda apple. This actually has spines and thorns on it. So another way that plants defend themselves is through the production of toxins, which is what we're talking about today. So like I said, the tomato itself, when it's ripe, isn't toxic. green tomato can be. We can say the same thing about other plants in that same family. Green berries on nightshade are considered toxic, but the ripe ones are not considered toxic. So why would green berries be toxic, but the ripe berries be non-toxic? So like I said earlier, plants can't move. The seeds in the unripe berries aren't mature enough for them to germinate and produce offspring. However, in the ripe berries, these seeds are mature, so these could be almost planted immediately and they would produce a new plant. So nothing would want to eat these because they know they're toxic, but then once they're ripened, a bird might eat these and fly off and deposit those seeds somewhere else. So it provides a way for these plants to move. Same can be said for tropical soda apple. It has kind of a double whammy. It has spines and thorns on it. When it's young, the fruit itself is young. It looks like a little tiny watermelon. It's not really that palatable. But once these fruits start to turn yellow, like this one is, it starts emitting a sweet fragrance to cattle and other wildlife, and they'll start consuming this fruit and then deposit the seeds in the woods or someplace else in the pasture. All right, so plants produce toxins to prevent herbivory or being eaten by livestock or even us in some cases. So how do they do that? Like I said, they produce toxins, but not all toxins are at the same level, and plants contain different levels of toxins depending on the species, or they may contain different levels of toxins depending on the time of year. So some plants only cause mild discouragement. So one of those is common ragweed, or one of the pigweed species that I've pulled up here. These really aren't toxic at all, but can be in situations under heavy fertilization when they accumulate nitrates. So some plants or some insects actually use toxic plants to their advantage. For example, the monarch butterfly, when it feeds on milkweed plants or milkweed species, they consume the toxin, which has a bitter taste to it. So then birds that want to feed on the monarch butterflies find out that those butterflies are now bitter. So they leave those monarch butterflies alone. So that's one case where nature protects nature. So how do we know if a plant is toxic or not? So it's pretty difficult because we really have to know our plants, but there are a couple things that we can look for that gives us an idea that the plants might be toxic. So one of those, in milkweed and spurges, they produce milky sap. And when you break the stem or leaf, it should exude that sap. And because I pulled this plant up, it's a little bit slower than normal, but the stem is now exuding milky sap where I broke that off. So there are many species that actually do this, and most of them are toxic, but not all of them. And some of them only cause irritation to the skin. There are three main classes of compounds that are found in plants that cause toxic symptoms in livestock. Those are alkaloids, cardiac glycosides, and cyanogenic glycosides. So I wanted to show you a couple examples from each of those classes. Alkaloids are produced in many plants, and they're actually detoxified in our liver. And in some cases, when it goes through that process, it actually makes the toxin more effective. So we really have to know our plants to be able to do that. So one of the plants that contains alkaloids is elderberry. So a lot of you might be confused by elderberry because you see elderberry jams and stuff like that. Well, it's much like the nightshades I talked about earlier. The green portions of the plant, the green berries, are toxic. The ripened fruit is non-toxic, which can be used. Elderberry is one of the strange plants because it contains two classes of compounds, the alkaloids, but also the cardiac glycosides. Other plants also contain cardiac glycosides, like bracken fern. And many of the ferns also contain that as well. The way to tell bracken fern from the rest of the ferns is it almost looks triangular in shape. A lot of legume species contain cardiac glycosides. In fact, lima beans originally contained cardiac glycosides, but they bred that gene out of those plants, so they're no longer toxic. But there are many plants within that same family that have different levels of toxicity. So one that we see a lot growing in wet areas, there's actually two. First one is hemp sesbania. This one, pretty non-toxic. The seeds contain the most toxin. A very similar species to hemp sesbania is bagpod. It's different from hemp sesbania in that its leaves or leaflets are bigger, but also it only produces 2 seeds per seed pod. And those seeds are much bigger, and they're actually much more toxic than the hemp sesbania seeds. 2 other species that people lump together is coffee senna and sicklepod. Now, since I've pulled these up, the leaves are trying to fold up on me, so you can't see all the characteristics. But both of these kind of have a bad odor to them, so normally nothing's going to want to eat them. But there have been cases with cattle on both of these where calves have started to lose weight, or in some cases even died from consuming so much fresh material of these coffee weeds. So again, these are also part of the bean family or the legume family. I'm going to cover also some crotallarias. So there's many different crotalaria species, and they all have different levels of toxicity associated with them. This one that I call smooth crotalaria has what they call trifoliate leaves. So it has 3 leaflets per leaf. This whole thing is a leaf, and it has 3 leaflets. Crotalaria has these pretty showy yellow flowers, and they produce these seed pods, and these seed pods will rattle when they're mature. So a lot of times you'll hear these called rattlebox. The most toxic of the crotallarias is the one called showy crotalaria, which is this plant here. And unlike the previous one, this has unifoliate leaves, so only 1 leaf. So it's pretty strange for a plant in the legume family to only have 1 leaf. Normally they're trifoliate or more compound than trifoliate. And then 2 more that are still part of the bean family is hairy indigo. This one, pretty much non-toxic. It does have a lot of hairs on the stem as well as the leaves, so it feels very soft when you touch it. It does cause sometimes some irritation of the mouth when cattle are consuming it, which may deter some grazing. A very closely related one is called creeping indigo. And this one lays flat on the ground, just like you see here, and it produces the same color of flower and the same type of seed pod as the hairy indigo. But this one is by far more toxic than the hairy indigo, and there have been a lot of horse deaths over the last several years because this grows so closely to the ground and people don't know it's there and it's hard to find. So it's really good to know this plant and be aware of it. So the last group of compounds are the cyanogenic glycosides. It's basically cyanide. So I talked about apple earlier. The seeds contain cyanide. Like I said, it takes a lot of seeds. So it would be equivalent probably to eating a pack of sunflower seeds if you want something relative. The other plant that produces cyanide is the wild cherry. So again, it's in the seeds, it's in the leaves of the cherry trees. So there are other classes of compounds as well, and they're specific to certain plants. So one of those is castor bean. And castor bean grows about 10 to 12 feet tall, has huge leaves that look kind of star-shaped, if you will. Sometimes it has milky sap, sometimes it doesn't. This contains ricin, which is one of the most toxic compounds that plants produce. So there's also a plant that's in the bean family called rosary pea that I don't have today, but it contains a compound called abrin, which is a sister compound to ricin. So that is extremely toxic, but it's again found in the seeds for the rosary pea. So the plants that do produce the most lethal compounds I've already talked about, and I've already talked about some plants that cause more mild discouragement from eating, if you will. So those plants produce compounds like oxalic acid. So if you've ever had rhubarb pie and it tastes kind of bitter, that's why. It's the oxalates that you're tasting. It tastes kind of bitter. Caladiums. Everybody knows what caladiums look like, I hope, in Florida. So they also produce oxalates. And there are other weeds outside of those that produce oxalates as well. Another one is the saponins, and I've already talked about those. That would be the tomatine and the solanine in the potatoes and the tomatoes. But also asparagus. So you have another excuse not to eat another vegetable, kids. And the last one's in tannins. Tannins, they really don't do much. They bind different proteins, but you really have to consume a lot. And it's really, again, it's discouraged livestock and people from eating those plants, but it doesn't keep you from eating them. So examples in that group would be corn, blueberry, grapes. Okay, so those contain tannins. So that concludes my portion today. So I'll turn it over to Clay Cooper, who will finish up the presentation on toxic plants, to eat or not to eat.
Hi, my name's Clay Cooper. I'm the Ag and Natural Resources Agent here in Citrus County. We're going to continue on with our discussion of toxic plants, what to eat, and what not to eat. But we're going to shift gears a little bit from Dr. Sellers' presentation on the interactions of toxic plants with humans, and we're going to focus in on those interactions with livestock. So as Dr. Sellers had mentioned, plants are stationary. So from the plant's perspective, what does that mean? Essentially, it means that they are inefficient at protecting themselves from predation when it comes to a mobility standpoint. Unlike you and I, plants aren't able to get up and move when they find themselves in harm's way. Therefore, they have to develop defense mechanisms to protect themselves from predation in their natural and native environments. One of the ways that they can do this is through chemical production. Chemical properties within the plant can be toxic to both humans and livestock. Another defense mechanism would be taste and odor. Some plants have an unpalatable taste, while others can put off a foul odor. Both of these serve as a defense mechanism for that plant and deter livestock from grazing them. Plant toxicity, though, can vary. When we talk about toxicity, we could have toxic symptoms from mild discomfort and irritation all the way to sudden death. So we can break plant toxicities into three categories. We have acute, chronic, and indirect. Acute toxicity would be a toxin that leads to rapid or sudden death, while chronic toxicity is a toxin within a plant that starts to accumulate and occur over time. Indirect, on the other hand, is when an animal actually comes in contact with a plant that may have thorns or stickers, and if that animal becomes punctured by that plant, and as a result of an infection sets in, that would be an example of an indirect cause. So why are toxic plants eaten? Most of the time, it's going to be when our desirable forage is scarce, and time of year plays a big role in that. This time of year, during our summer months, we have an abundance amount of forage. Our days are longer, our weather's warmer, and we're getting adequate rainfall, which puts our forage production at its peak. Now, when we start to move later into the year and get into those fall and winter months, our warm season perennial pastures start to go dormant. During those times, forage availability becomes scarce, and those animals are now browsing, looking to find the roughage and forages that they need to meet their dietary needs. Another time when toxic plants may be eaten is in poorly managed systems. For instance, if we have a production pasture that has been overgrazed, we now are forcing those animals to again start to browse and look for the necessary roughage and fibers to meet their dietary needs, and they may come in contact with some of those less desirable or toxic plants that they may otherwise avoid if adequate forage was available. Another instance would be within wooded pastures. When we think about a wooded pasture, what's one of the first things we think of? Obviously, trees. Those trees are going to create a dense shade canopy, which is going to create an environment that is not conducive for forage production. Forage needs natural sunlight in order to be able to effectively and efficiently grow. So within those shaded canopies, we're going to have weakened and reduced forage production, which is going to allow for weed encroachment. Another example would be in contaminated hays or feeds. This time of year, as we mentioned, we have excess forage. A lot of that excess forage is put up in dry hay. If that hay field has not been cleaned and there's weeds present, and if some of those weeds are toxic, when that hay is preserved and fed out at a later date, those animals can then consume a dried variation of that toxic plant and become poisoned at that point in time. Curiosity of young animals can also be problematic. If we have a group of young heifers that we turned into this field here behind me, more times than not what you're going to find is those animals are going to be curious. They're going to be interested to learn about their new environment. They're going to browse your fence lines. They're going to wander throughout the field, and they're going to start tasting things to find out what they like, what they don't like, and therefore, if we have toxic plants present, it could create a problem for us. In some cases, livestock can even develop a taste for poisonous plants. We've seen this in the instance with creeping indigo in horses. If a horse is turned out and introduced to creeping indigo, in some cases they may develop a taste and they'll actually start to target that plant within that forage production system. So if we think our animals have been introduced to a toxic plant, what are some symptoms that we could look for? A few examples would be staggering, depression, labored breathing, diarrhea, the animal may become lethargic, and the list goes on. It's always important to consult with your veterinarian though, because many other illnesses related to livestock can express these same symptoms. So we want to make sure that we consult with the veterinarian to rule out any other illnesses, so that way we don't overlook the health of the animal. So how can we prevent plant-related toxicities? One of the easiest ways is by scouting new or even established fields for that matter. If we can go out and start to scout those fields and identify some of those problematic or toxic weed species, we can start to develop a control protocol and try to limit the exposure that our animals have to those plant species. For example, I just took a look around here where I'm standing before we started this video, and I was able to find sicklepod, coffee senna, lantana, and nightshade. So right here within probably 15-20 feet of me, we were able to find 4 toxic plant species. Now that may seem like a lot, but in reality, we have over 700 toxic plant species, so being able to identify those is going to be critical in helping you scout and develop control plans to reduce the amount of exposure that your animals are going to have to toxic plants. Another way that we can prevent exposure is to provide adequate feed and forages. Again, we want to make sure that these feed and forages are free of any toxic weeds, but by adding or providing adequate forage, we can try to reduce the amount of time that those animals are browsing and looking for excess roughage to meet their dietary needs, and we can try to mitigate the exposure that they have to toxic plants. We can also take preventative measures to control these weeds. As I mentioned, I just found 4 weed species right here around me. So right now, with an abundant amount of forage during our summer months, they may not be a major issue, but I know now moving forward as we get later into the year and this forage starts to become less available, that those animals may start to come in contact with those plants, and I need to do something about it before that time gets here. So now that allows me to start to develop a control plan and get those weeds removed from the system. We can do this through chemical application, or in an instance of a small area, we could even hand pull. It's always best to use an integrated approach, and that could be chemical, that could be cultural, biological. The best thing that we can do is take preventative measures. And like I mentioned, by doing an integrated approach, we can efficiently control the weeds within the system. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about toxic weeds today, what to eat and what not to eat, both for yourself and your livestock. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the youth field day,